So how does Russia think about the issue of European security? Well, I would suggest that Russia's overarching objective is long-standing, and it boils down to the re-establishment of itself as a great power in Europe. Now, that means a number of things. It means essentially that Russia is entitled to several things. First of all, the entitlement to play a so-called privileged role in wider European security affairs. Now, ideally via a continent-wide treaty-based system along the lines of the draft European Security Treaty proposed by then President Medvedev in 2009, or failing that, through some sort of mechanism or arrangement that would weaken or neutralise Western-led security organisations, primarily NATO. An example of such a mechanism would be the diplomatic notes that Russia submitted in December 2021, which would have crippled the credibility of NATO as an institution, I suggest. So that's entitlement number one. Entitlement number two is to exert strategic control over its neighbours, first and foremost Ukraine. Entitlement number three is the right to be able to build a domestic system of governance as it chooses, free from external criticism, free from external pressure. And then finally, the entitlement to be acknowledged by others as a great power according to these criteria. Now, Russia has routinely packaged its objective to re-establish itself as a great power in Europe as a putative pan-European security system or a new system of European security. The implication being that a new institutional architecture for European security can somehow dissolve these underlying profound differences. The question of wider European security, well, I would refer people to Putin's speech to the Russian Foreign Ministry in June this year, where he said in terms that the post-Cold War Euro-Atlantic security order has collapsed and needs to be replaced. It's indicative, it's instructive, I think, that Russia has been this year returning to the two foreign ministry notes that it submitted in December 2021, which I argue would fundamentally cripple Ukraine's credibility as an organisation. That Russia has still not given up on this more ambitious goal of some sort of continent-wide treaty-based system. So might we be looking at a reappearance of an updated version of Medvedev's draft European Security Treaty at some point?
Well, it is a Russia-Ukrainian war, but it's part of a bigger project. And it's actually, I think it's World War III. And the West has just lost phase one of a World War III, even without knowing that it is at war. And it is the paradox. The war is expanding. Where we stand now at the end of 2024 is a combination of three factors: Ukrainian resilience, Russian incompetence, and Western indecisiveness. That it is not a war over Ukraine. It's a war for the world order. And Putin, indeed, he has to be given credit in the sense that he made no secret of his plans. But his threats were not taken at face value. I think the decision to confront the West and to challenge the world order was taken as early as 2003, 2004. Definitely in 2004, at the times of the color revolutions and the first Ukrainian Maidan. The first public appearance of this new doctrine was in Munich in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference. At that time, and there's actually a lot of evidence to this, the minds in the Kremlin were fascinated by a certain book by a political fiction writer, Mikhail Yuryev, called The Third Empire. That's an obscure figure. He has died since. He is a businessman turned a political visionary, and he wrote this utopia called The Third Empire. It's a world in 2035 after a limited nuclear war, which is ruled by three superpowers: Russia, China, and the United States. And Russia has a full run over Eurasia, except the Chinese sphere of influence. Indeed, the policy was quite straightforward. Because following the Munich announcement, which was a sort of a cold shower for the West, followed Georgia War, the 5-day war in August 2008. Almost no response from the West. So what was followed was the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass, 2014. Very limited response from the West, and it just openly paved the way to 2022, to the big invasion of 2022. So this whole line is not just Russia's decision, but it's the West's inaction. So Russia wasn't deterred, Russia wasn't stopped at any of these points. So it just continued, and it will continue until it is defeated. That Russia is not winning, but the West is losing. And that's a paradox. Mm-hmm. The world order, let's face it, the world order is shattered. Not yet crumbling, but shattered. The West's credibility has been severely undermined. Whereas China is eagerly studying the Russian example of circumventing sanctions and just joining in the world trade and eagerly looking at Taiwan. So really China is a big player here, and it's very carefully looking at how the war in Ukraine unravels and what is the West's reaction to this. Now, what we also learned in the past year or two is that the West no longer holds the keys to globalization. Sanctions didn't work, let's face it. Russia sells all at once. Russia gets all the technology it needs for continuing the war. So sanctions circumvented, oil exported, and Russia finds allies. And actually there is one big thing that unites them all, and this is anti-Americanism. And actually the latent joy of seeing the West fail in this war over Ukraine. The West has no strategy and no end goal in this war. So Russia is seen as too big to fail, too big to be defeated, too big to be excluded from the New World Order, from the alternative security architecture. And it still exports fear. Shame to learn that Czechia had exported 1 billion euros worth of military aid to Ukraine and consumed 7 billion euros worth of Russian oil. I'm fueling my car in the Czech Republic, I'm fueling with Russian oil from Polish gas stations like Orlen and so on. That's amazing. 1-7 is the ratio. We're still running on Russian oil. This war sadly resembles another one, and this is World War II. We're somewhere in the years leading up to 1939. I think we're in 1938. We have already seen the Anschluss of Austria, and we're looking at the Munich Agreement and the following occupation of the Sudetenland and the destruction of Czechoslovakia. And the West is absolutely equally undecided and unprepared to fight the aggressor as it was in 1938. So I think the real deficit in the West now is not that of ammunition, even the political will, it's the lack of imagination. Try to imagine a future in which Russia can be defeated and Putin regime can be destroyed, and only this can be a guarantee for the existence of Ukraine, not just sovereignty and territorial integrity, but the very existence of Ukraine.
I think a lot of places, a lot of people, even this institute is a little bit nervous of comparisons with the Hitler regime in World War II. But I think the analogy holds. It's not perfect, no analogy ever is, but I think you're right to bring it up, so I appreciate that. Thank you very much indeed.
The 2021 National Security Strategy established the goal of making Russia, quote, one of the most influential centres of the modern world, while also noting its willingness to use symmetric and asymmetric measures to achieve this while curbing unfriendly actions. And then, 2021, all mentions of cooperation with Europe, the US and G20 were expunged. The idea of the front door of Europe being closed and the back door becoming the facade on the world. I think Russian objectives can be discerned as consistent, reopposing dominion over Russia's non-NATO neighbours, including subjugating Ukrainian statehood and nationhood, re-establishing Russia as maybe the global security actor in Europe at the expense of the Americans, wielding global influence through a so-called multipolar world at the expense of the West, and entrenching power at home through a weird nationalistic state ideology based on patriotism, cultural exceptionism, and vehement anti-Westernism. Now, there are many hurdles to achieve this intent, as we saw over the weekend in Syria. Russia isn't the Soviet Union, but the intent is clear, as we saw in 2021 demands on legal, reliable security guarantees in Europe, or Malafeyev speaking to the FT last week about some sort of global Yalta with added Messianic Christianity. So where does it leave us in Europe? I don't agree with alarmist talks that we're in a pre-war period necessarily, that World War III has started, or this is 1938 moments. I agree with the Chief of Defence Staff that NATO, as long as we remain united, overmatches Russia conventionally and can inflict devastating punishment in extremis. I think rather Putin seeks to achieve his intent in Europe through indirect means: interference, threats, disinformation, nuclear messaging, espionage, cyber attacks, assassinations, to divide us, to dishearten us and to weaken us, to achieve Russian goals indirectly.
Of course, Russia's intentions towards Europe is to control Europe and to see Europe in the sphere of influence of Grand Eurasia. This is very clear. And personally for me, it's already 11 years of work in different capacity from 2014 when Russia invaded Ukraine, when I couldn't imagine that this war will take more than a decade and Ukrainian armed forces will be in Kursk. If someone would tell me in 2014, like, Hannah, this is just the beginning and this war will prepare the ground for the World War III in hybrid format, then in real confrontation, aggression. And from the green man in Crimea to drones and electronic warfare. And if someone could say, like, Ukrainians without the navy would destroy or demilitarize Russian navy presence in the Black Sea. So this is, or Asian troops, North Korean troops will be at the European soil. Mm-hmm. In 2014, it could be like a fantasy. But this is the reality. And reality is like this war is winnable one. Because what's happening in Ukraine, it's a pure genocide. This is what happened in last century during the Soviet times when Stalin organized a man-made famine, Holodomor. So now Russia is weaponizing hunger through the blockade or destroying ports in the Black Sea and not allowing Ukraine to export grain. It's weaponization of hunger, but against the global South countries. So if there is a will to provide Ukraine or to arm Ukraine to win, and using different asymmetrical also approach and measures like blockade of Russian oil tankers in Baltic Sea and other, why it's not happening? Confiscation of Russian sovereign assets. You could use this money, confiscate 300 billion, reinvest it in other spheres, earn more than you are earning now, like 5 billion per year. You could get 10 or 15 billion per year, reinvest in this money, and actually provide this money for Ukraine. I'm very thankful to Nordic countries, especially for Denmark, for their Danish initiative, investing in Ukrainian defense industries. Because we are producing now probably the best in the world drones. And there are also Ukrainian rockets, Neptunes, and many others. So Ukraine definitely could be considered in the future as a defense hub. So very interesting data. They just did it 2 weeks ago. What are the best security guarantees for Ukraine? Ukrainians responded. 31% it's nuclearization of Ukraine. 29% it's NATO membership. Can you imagine? So people now understand that 30 years ago, when we gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, it was just December 5th, the 30th anniversary of signing the Budapest Memorandum, this sheet of paper. And now we signed 28 security agreements, another paper guarantees, which mean nothing, because this is not the real guarantees. And 30 years ago, when Ukraine gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal, of course, we expected that maybe Ukraine will be invited to NATO or economic development or our industries. Nothing happened. So this war, Russian aggression, started 30 years ago. We've never seen the Sixth Fleet of the U.S. in the Black Sea back in 2014. And we have to connect the dots between what's happening in the Red Sea or happened in the Red Sea this summer and what happened in the Black Sea back in 2014, because the weak reaction on the illegal annexation of Crimea provoked Russia for more aggressions. So this is, I think, also another very important data from today's presentation in Kyiv. People's attitude towards negotiations with Russia. 64% against negotiations with Russia without security guarantees from the West. Preconditions for negotiations. 39% think that withdrawal of Russian troops, this is the precondition. You could be happy that you have NATO, but you have to answer the question if NATO is ready to defend Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia. Maybe they could say, like in 1938, who will die for Gdansk? So because for all these years, I always believed in liberal democracy, because it was about values. But I do not believe anymore, because humanity doesn't end at NATO borders. Morality doesn't end at the EU and NATO borders. If we are all for values, then why Germany is not providing Taurus for Ukraine? Why Americans having 3,000 ATACMS are not providing more for us? Why Storm Shadows are not in Ukraine? Lack of imagination, this is something when you are self-limiting yourself in this fear of escalation. The West is so proud that you are so economically strong, but your lack of imagination and lack of bravery, which is really what Russia is using. And now Kremlin propaganda and Russia is trying to make these very narrow options, either Ukraine capitulation or big World War III. And this is talking to many decision makers abroad. I feel this like, Hanna, what will happen if Russia will throw? Today, we are in our chat of our ENS network, people are telling that Oreshnik might be used from Belarusian territory. Mm-hmm. And people just laughing in the chat, telling, oh, come on, let's see the reaction of our Western partners. This is the message for them. This is not the message for Ukrainians, honestly. And our famous t-shirt diplomacy, how without this? Make Russia small again. Which is... this is another side.
Okay.
No, but this is very important to explain, because this is Moscow size, and this is current Russian Federation. Remember, back in May this year, when there are some official statements telling that Russia wants to redraw the maritime borders in Baltic Sea, pretending that they will increase its power. So I think it's really important talking about Russian imperialism. And for Russian speakers, watch the video from Putin and Sokurov debates back in December 2021. This is very important debates. When Putin debated with Sokurov, who blamed Russia, that Moscow is the capital of Moscow, that Russian Federation doesn't care about other republics, regions, Putin became very angry and told, like, do you want Russia to return in the size of Moscow? This is what NATO wants. This will never happen. But Putin mentioned that there are more than 200 territorial claims inside Russian Federation. So be brave, use your imagination, and make Russia as it has to be.
Putin is Hitler and Stalin in one. Except that Russia as a state is a very weak state. But yes, ideology is exactly the same. Everybody wants peace, but this understanding is very divisive. And you know, I am getting a similar feeling to how I felt in 2022, February, when this large-scale attack happened. At that time, I had a feeling of guilty that us, the Baltics, the Poles, could not manage to convince our allies that their policy towards Putin is a grave mistake. And here in this Chatham House conference is right time to quote Winston Churchill. You are given the choice between war and dishonor. You choose dishonor and you will have war. Because Putin, again, believes that democracies are weak and it's very easy to attack them. Putin is an opportunist. He only advances as far as he is allowed to go. And we are allowing him to go. So our interest is very obvious and clear that we need next to us to have normal Russia. Not aggressive, not imperialistic, not colonial at all. And how to achieve this is the question. Why we are afraid to stop Russia or to defeat Putin's regime? After all, it was fear that led to the fundamental mistake made in Bucharest in 2008, when Ukraine and Georgia were denied NATO membership. But I can tell you a lot that Putin was ready to attack us, Baltics. But Ukrainians helped us and saved us in 2014. His previous plan A was to test NATO via Baltics. And it didn't happen because he had to move to plan B. Therefore, the only correct strategy toward Russia now is to help Ukraine win, assist it in joining the EU, and invite it into NATO.
I think the way we deal with Russia has to be the 3 C's, I would call it. So one is we have to coordinate with each other, of all the like-minded nations who believe in those values, the European values, but also the transatlantic values. And we must make sure that an international front is what is always presented to Russia, whether before, during, or after this illegal war with Ukraine. Because the one thing I think Putin desperately wants is acceptance in the international community, and he cannot be comfortable relying on both China and North Korea. He just can't be. I mean, if that's as good as you get, North Korea, then that's not the vision he had of his great position in the world. So I think that's really important, that we coordinate, and there is strength through coordination. Now we have NATO, we have something very unique with NATO, we have an Article 5, we have a pooling of sovereignty in a way that other international groupings don't really have successfully. The UN Security Council does a lot, but never manages to deliver much on those issues. The EU, of course, the United Kingdom left the EU, but fundamentally, I used to find that the EU was quite slow at getting there, and obviously having to go at the slowest pace of the person, usually Hungary on this issue, at the back. Whereas NATO absolutely is a united front, and throughout the whole of this, we have seen Russia be actually very careful not to slip into attacking a NATO country above the threshold. They know the strength of NATO as an organisation. So first of all, coordinate is important. And then I think calibrate. I was in Berlin last week, and Olaf Scholz is going to present to his people that he's cautious, right? And that's why he's the guy for the job. He wasn't cautious, is my view. He was actually entirely wrong in his handling, and indeed he was hesitant and confused, and in doing so emboldened Putin. Actually, you need to calibrate when you deal with Russia, in my view, which is they do something, you work out the response in a language they understand, but also where you are not going to be intimidated. So when we were arming Ukraine throughout the build-up, we made sure that we calibrated our response to their behaviors. So when, for example, they started hitting civilian territory early on, civilian buildings, I said, right, we're going to arm Ukraine with the short-range anti-aircraft missiles, the Starstreak missiles that have been so damaging to Russian helicopters. And I made sure that we always calibrated our response, both in military assistance, but also, I think, in our sanctions, etc. And I think it's really important that the Russian leadership understands why things are done to them, or not, as the case may be. And that's why the last C is communicate. I think it's really important. We just don't do it and let their imagination carry away with themselves that somehow there's great conspiracy, or that there's an MI6 officer behind every single pillar trying to plot the downfall of Russia, which is quite a common theme in Putin's world. And so every time I, for example, put a new weapon system into Ukraine, I would ask the department, we would summon the local GRU resident Hood from the embassy. He's no longer there now, he's on a one-way ticket, he's had to leave. which is a bit of a pity, that's my personal view, I didn't want them expelled, because it was really important to communicate, we are doing this today because you did this yesterday. Because you indiscriminately bombed Odessa, we are going to put in Storm Shadow, or whatever it was. So they knew, one, they might have disagreed, they might have thought that's the wrong answer, but whatever it was, there was a communication of our position. And I think those 3 C's are very, very important when it comes to deterrence, and it also comes to dealing with Russia in the long term. And that's why I come back at the end of this to my point about being true to ourselves. Right? We shouldn't be in a position where, because it's the easier thing to do, is to compromise ourselves in dealing with Russia. And if that means there's a big C at the end of this called containment, uncomfortable as that might be, and we just contain Russia and carry on with our lives and leave them to have Christmas parties with North Korea, whatever they want to, then so be it. It's not the perfect response. It's maybe not the way to deal with Russia for those people who think that Russia is something to give the world, but it's going to take us to compromise in order to do something different. And I think the strongest messaging we can globally say is, this is who we are, this is what we stand for, this is our rule of law, this is our respect of human rights. And I'm afraid that is it. And if you don't want to do that, then off you go and play with whoever. But fundamentally, we're in the business in Europe and continental Europe of doing that. And maybe people will say, oh, you can't make Russia change. Russia's always like that. But I think we just have to be true to ourselves, because that's all we have. That's my book. That's all we have to what we are and why we're better than them in what we stand for. We are better than those people that commit war crimes. We are better. Our soldiers are better than that. Our people are better than that. The Ukrainians are better than that. And therefore, I think we just have to stick to that. And if that means containment, Iron Curtain, whatever you want to call it, which is not the best option, but fundamentally, it's how we maintain our values and our position. I came to Ukraine with an offer to train thousands of people. We've trained 50,000 now. We will fly them out of Ukraine, brought them to British bases and train them. And I said, look, it's a partnership. If we don't train people to use those weapon systems properly, if we don't train people to have better survival rates, this conflict could go south very quickly. So that's actually what I said. So we could always do more. Some of it, we get too hooked up on totemic individual weapon systems. Right? So when we were talking about could we fire Storm Shadow into Russia, I kept trying to say, no. The real pressure should be trying to get Germany to release Taurus within Ukraine, because those are big stocks, right? Yes, we need to be able to strike, going back to being true to ourselves, in accordance with international law. We have a right to support a country who wishes to strike the bases in a country that is prosecuting an illegal war against them. That is international law, right? You're allowed to do it. Ukraine is allowed to strike Russian bases prosecuting the war. International law doesn't let them strike some random base on the far side of Vladivostok, but fundamentally, if that base is prosecuting. So I think it's really important that we don't always end up with the usual cycle of totemic weapon go around in circles. What we need to continue to do is support Ukraine in the mass. Could we have done more? We probably could have all trained more, but we also would ask Ukraine to release more people. Could we have put British soldiers in the west of Ukraine to train people? I think, well, we already did. I was public. We sent medics to help train Lviv Ukrainians. It didn't get much media, but actually they were military medics, right? Why can't we? We're allowed to. International law. They weren't combat. So we could have maybe done some more training in Ukraine if the Ukrainians had wanted it. But I think, could we have ramped up our productions? Yeah, we all could have done. Europe could have really... The penny should have dropped in Europe that there is a war on in Europe and we need to go to a sort of war footing.
What matters for us, I think, is that the aims that Russia has are very consequential, right? So it wants to create or restore its sphere of influence and territory in the east, and Ukraine is currently, and I stress the word currently, the center of gravity. So really what's at stake is the European security order and also our values. And military, of course, plays an important part for Russia to project power. And when you look at sort of the war of attrition in Ukraine, And when you listen to the foreign minister, Landsbergis, the aim is annihilation of a nation in this regard. But here's something as well to bear in mind, that Russia is not omnipotent. Its resources are not unlimited, right? Look at what's happening in Syria. I agree with Ben here. Indeed, Russia is trying to leverage its partnerships. It's trying to sort of get out of isolation and turn these sort of partnerships into strategic alignments. I think what's also interesting is that Russia is also trying to compensate, right? What you have here is it's trying to use nuclear coercion. I mean, you had Oreshnik, you had the IDI, RBMM, and you have the sub-threshold activities. And that's important, because I think what I'm seeing is something that I have come to realize, that the absence of war is no longer peace, right? And that's quite profound, because quite often the laws that we have put in place reflect the time of peace. The acquisition processes we have in place reflect the time of peace. But we're kind of in this place, and we're being boiled like a frog. And I think the bad thing here is if we get used to this new normal. In other words, when it comes to escalation management, we kind of go along with that escalation. I think that's bad. We need to resist that. A Russian victory or success will have, I think, an enormous effect on the stability in Europe. First and foremost, of course, breaking with the principle that borders should not be changed by force. But make no mistake, it will also change our way of life, the way we do business, accumulate wealth, live our lives. I guess some of us will have to sort of start learning Russian. So this is what's at stake, and that's why, to me, it's important. So for those of us that are looking at the strategy piece, and I will come to it next, I think there's an important shift that needs to happen. So instead of thinking about security with Russia, as it used to be the paradigm, I think you need to look at how to defend against Russia, and that's something quite different. Not surprisingly, I mean, we stand where we sit. I sit at NATO, so my response to that would be strengthening our deterrence and defense. And here comes the bitter pill. NATO has a key role to play. I think it's an excellent platform. We have risen to the challenge in the past. We can do so also in the future, but I kid you not, this will require significant increases in spending. Well beyond 2%, long-term investments in defense, right? So somebody mentioned this morning that it is a contest of resources, and it is. We need to put money to this thing. In many ways, we almost need to outproduce Russia's reconstitution. You heard D-Secure talking about the 2-3 year timeline, right? Because that's what it takes for them to reconstitute, and I tend to agree with that. Very specifically, because some of you have been sort of asking about it earlier today, I think we need to focus on how to strengthen land forces, in particular air defense, strike capabilities, and also modernizing nuclear capabilities, right? But here's the catch: money is not for free, right? So there are going to be some difficult decisions ahead. I mean, usually the choices that you have is, you either raise taxes, you cannibalize other budget lines, or you borrow the money. So these are the difficult decisions ahead. So the challenge, in other words, still remains: be ready to fight tonight against this sort of weakened but risk-prone Russia that I think still possesses many capabilities that can still hold allies at risk. Okay, we might talk about degradation of conventional land forces, but the air forces are still there, the naval part as well. I would also say that we need to strengthen the European pillar of NATO, and I suspect that the incoming U.S. administration will have a thing or two to say about that, particularly as it sort of focuses on burden sharing. In other words, bottom line here, I think we need to have a more agile deterrence posture, right? Yes, on one hand, be mindful not to contribute to inadvertent escalation, but also I think that sort of strikes me that we seem to be deterred by our own fears. Be ready to deny Russia advantages, but also their own initiative, right? Should be able to create strategic dilemmas for them. Now, when it comes to the sort of the below the threshold space, a couple of quick words. Yes, we do live in an interconnected world. Our economies are intertwined. Yes, Russia continues to meddle and pose dilemmas on us. You see them doing that in the Middle East. You see that in Africa. You have the DPRK angle and what have you. But I would like to also stress that we have also instruments, and we have also sort of ability to play that game. And Russia has vulnerabilities. So I think the key thing here, for me, would be not to be deterred by our own fear in this regard. So agree with Ben. If I had sort of three sort of elements of that strategy that needs to emerge, that would be to contain Russia, to support Ukraine's fight for independence, and to constrain Russia's ability to wage war, to reconstitute. It's going to sort of take us time, but without doing so, I think we're bound to fail. So in summing up, somebody asked, is it too late, earlier this morning? I think it's not too late. I think we can do it. But I would also like to say that we don't have much time. So that time window is not going to be there forever. This is not going to be a cost-free competition. It will entail costs for us. And I would also say that big nations need to lead. Indeed, when I look at the figures, I think when I look at the European nations, I think everybody's able to sort of maneuver and operate at the brigade level. But quite often it's the core and the divisional level, right? When we need big nations to step up. Core and divisional level enablers. And finally, I'd go back to the citizens, right? Because this is going to be a sort of, this will entail costs. It's not a cost-free sort of competition. I think the citizens will need to understand what's at stake for them so as to go along with the direction, with the sort of strategic direction that we have set for ourselves.
First of all, I want to insist that events of the last decade have turned Europe, especially in its eastern part, in the battleground of fierce struggle. In Ukraine, the war against the Russian aggression, which is bloodiest and the most destructive conflict since the Second World War, has continued for over 1,000 days. Meanwhile, the Eastern Mediterranean faces a series of active conflicts. Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria reflecting tensions between Israel and Iran. The international security system has eroded and fails to fulfill its core function, resolving conflicts in a non-military way. The threat of an uncontrolled escalation with unpredictable consequences is the greatest in decade. The best scenario for European security lies in a stable and effective global order, where European nations play a leading role. As the president of Ukraine stated during a recent briefing with the newly appointed president of European conflict, if the conflict is frozen without any strong position for Ukraine, then Putin will return in 2, 3, 5 years. He will come back and destroy us completely. He will try to annihilate us. Therefore, our goal must be not a temporary truce, but a stable and sustainable peace. When designing peace in Eastern Europe, we should consider the following. First, the war which started as a Russian blitzkrieg to take Kiev in 3 days has now lasted for almost 3 years. Ukraine has resisted not only Russia itself. In fact, anti-Western network has been already formed and united by a common confrontation with the West. This network includes at least Iran and North Korea. The second one, Russia has very close economic and technological ties with China. You know this better than me. The third, Russian narratives extend beyond its borders, influencing many Western countries, but primarily the states of the global South. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is a part of broader global processes, and we should take into account and we should understand. But that Ukraine is not just a European question; it's a question of the global security. For over 20 years, Russia has employed hybrid warfare tools in Ukraine. This war started from the hybrid war. Nowadays, such tools become increasingly evident in the EU and NATO countries. And it's not only propaganda and disinformation, and many people think. It's also about economic and energy pressure. Cyber tracks, intelligence operations, the use of corruption for political and security purposes, leveraging criminal networks and shadow schemes. Acts of sabotage and subversion have also become numerous cases. That's why sustainable peace requires not just the end of hostilities, but also the termination of hybrid warfare, or at least the development of effective and coordinated countermeasures which will deter Russia in this sphere. Fourth, in the 33 years since the U.S.A. collapse, Russia has failed to resolve any conflict or promote lasting stability in any country. Instead, it consistently exported instability, shaped wars and conflicts in neighboring states and other regions such as Middle East and Africa. The case of Syria, which happened a few days ago, is a strong proof that Russia can destabilize but can't stabilize. And it's determined Russian constraints and Russian limits. Fifth, Donald Trump's convincing victory in the US presidential election reflects a strong demand of American people for change, both domestically and foreign policy. There are many consequences of this event, but one of the most important for us is that European nations should take a bigger role, bigger impact on the situation and including security sphere. Six, the existence of the security gray zone is traditionally viewed by Russia not as a threat, but an innovation to act. Holy place is never empty. Russians strongly remember this phrase. Ukraine must be integrated in the Western economic and security system, becoming not merely pro-Western, but a fully Western state. We strongly understand that we should transform those things, but Ukraine should become a Western state. And last but not least, the time is limited. We are in a critical phase of struggle. Its results will determine directly how safe the future world will be. It's critical not to lose this opportunity. Thank you.
And it's true we have a gigantic collective GDP and lots of advanced technologies and 500 million people and things like that. But what the West is lacking dramatically is, I would say, cognitive resilience. I mean, the Western mental maps and also myths and stereotypes that about Russia that the West has embraced make the West vulnerable and put the entire global security order at risk. What to do? First, we should creatively adapt to Russian strategic culture, which is totally different from Western strategic culture, and many politicians and experts also still tend not to understand it or underestimate it. We should raise the cost of Russian aggressive foreign policy, and we should try to influence Moscow's calculations. Create strategic dilemmas and ambiguities for the adversary, yes, and also present it with fait accompli to narrow Russia's scope for reflexive control vis-à-vis the EU and NATO. And I would say that Ukraine NATO membership would be one of those fait accompli. I mean, if Russia sees that there is no room for maneuver, for blackmail, and for trying to prevent certain developments, I'm pretty sure they will at certain point stop this blackmailing. What we tend to underestimate in the West is that Russia has weaponized the language. Still too many people fall for the Russian manipulation. I mean, when Russia uses the word negotiations, we still tend to put into this term the content that we usually understand behind this term. When Russia speaks about its security interest and so on, we tend to project our understanding of these words, but Russia actually signals totally different intentions. And also, what I would like to underline is that Russia understands war in a very particular way. I mean, war for Russia is an all-encompassing endeavor, and I would say that the military force is used during the very last phase of the whole war process. I mean, Russia is perfectly aware of the relative weakness of its army. So Russia historically has tended to introduce the army as a factor only at the stage when, in Russia's eyes, the ground had been prepared for this stage. And I'm pretty sure that Russia attacked Ukraine in 2022 precisely because Putin was pretty sure that the ground had been already prepared by the FSB, for example, in Ukraine to welcome the Russian army with flowers, which wasn't true. And this is a bit about whether Russia is ready to attack NATO or not. Not as long as Russia is pretty sure that Article 5 will be activated. But if Russia sees or perceives NATO as a weak alliance, not ready to activate the Article 5 in the case of, for example, a minor military incursion into the Baltic states, there can be a strong temptation to test the ground. So what if Russia miscalculates again? What if Russia again expects that we wouldn't react? They might take this step, unfortunately. A second thing that is needed to be done, we should decolonize Western mental maps and the perception of the Eastern Europe. The traditional Russia first policy, Russia first because Russia is big, because Russia is nuclear, should be replaced by prioritizing relations with other smaller states, first of all with Ukraine, that can offer a peaceful, stable and win-win cooperation. Then we should delegitimize Putin's regime. I mean, we keep legitimizing him after decades of doing so. And just to give you some examples, why Western companies are still operating in Russia after almost 3 years of this war. Why are we still buying Russian oil, feeding its military with our Western money? What was Lavrov doing at the OSCE meeting, and what is Russia doing in OSCE after 3 years of this war? I would say it's in the West's strategic interest to bring about Putin's departure from power, which could open a window of opportunity for political change. Putin is not anymore a legitimate president because he ran unconstitutionally in the last election, and he's an internationally wanted criminal. Let's delegitimize him also in the eyes of the Russian elite and nomenclatura. We need to compromise and discredit his imperial project, prove other belligerent leaders that war is counterproductive as a tool of foreign policy. Otherwise, future Russian governments will again try to build their legitimacy on stoking revanchist sentiment. How to discredit the imperial project? I mean, obviously, Russia's defeat in Ukraine and a deep economic crisis inside Russia due to Western sanctions, but also due to the fact that the Russian government still chooses to invest in guns, and at a certain point it will drastically limit the investments into butter, so the basic social needs of the population. We should be open to the idea of political change in Russia as a path to lasting peace in Europe. The West has fetishized the idea of Russia's stability. And, I'm Polish, so I assume I'm allowed to be hawkish. But from our historical experience, it's quite obvious that every time in our history, when Russia was too weak or too unstable to meddle into its neighbors' affairs, the world was safer. Its neighbors were safer. They could be sovereign, fully sovereign. And also the position of the West in the international order would be much stronger. So people fear Russia's destabilization, although this super stable Russia has produced the biggest threat in Europe since 1945. I don't believe in Russia's democratization. I mean, maybe in some decades, maybe. But what is an achievable goal, to the best of my understanding of the situation, is the minimum level of pluralism in Russia and a minimum level of scrutiny of the Kremlin's actions and decisions from other groups of influence. We should support all kinds of democratic groups inside and outside Russia, civil society, political opposition, and independent journalism in a systemic and long-term way. Regardless of who comes to power after Putin, a normalization of Western relations with Russia should be conditional not only on Moscow abandoning its aggressive foreign policy and paying compensation for war crimes, but also on political liberalization inside Russia. So zero tolerance toward human rights violations, because growing repression was actually a prelude to foreign aggression. I often hear a question from my colleague experts: what if someone worse than Putin comes to power after Putin? I would say that Putin is a leading imperialist and leading nationalist and a war criminal who effectively controls the nomenclatura, the society, and the resources inside the country, and who has made himself personally hostage to this war. So I can't imagine anyone worse, but let's assume that someone worse pops up. This person will be much weaker than Putin, I mean automatically, before this person consolidates his or her, probably his, power. And we can prevent it. So again, what I would envisage is rather some kind of a pluralism by default and maybe some kind of fierce infighting in Russia, but again, at least they would not attack their neighbors. So we could see some minimum level of scrutiny from other pyramids of power. Also, the nuclear argument is often raised. I mean, what about the safety of Russia's nuclear arsenal? The same arguments were presented in 1991, and we sort of managed to sort it out. So I would also point to my expectation the new Russian leadership would be vitally interested in gaining some kind of international legitimacy, and nuclear factor will be crucial in that. There is also, as regards the possible Russia's collapse or disintegration because of the demise of this over-centralized authoritarian power after Putin, I would say that I don't see any premises to expect a collapse of the Russian state, because Russia is much more resilient than in 1991 to all kinds of these developments. But what we need is the future federalization, decentralization, and decolonization of Russia. And actually, among the society, the idea of local self-governance is quite popular. My last point, we often ask a question, what kind of Russia are we likely to see in a decade or so? I would strongly suggest reformulating this question: what kind of Russia we want to see, and what are we ready to do in order to at least try to achieve this goal? Because we tend to forget that we, the West, have actual agency. And we can have impact not only on Russia's foreign policy, but also, although mostly indirectly, on Russia's domestic developments. This, of course, would be extremely difficult to pursue this kind of proactive policy, but I think this is perfectly doable. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you.